Hello, my name is Denise Scaloni. Several years ago, I decided to start my own home-based business. I was so fortunate to have such wonderful women help me along the way. I decided to start the show, Empowering Women. Today's a special show. My guest today is Jack Carroll, founder of Battle Ready Leadership. Jack is going to tell some stories about some empowering women during the Gettysburg Battle. Stories that you've probably never heard before. These were truly the first empowering women. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. My guest today is Jack Carroll, founder of Battle Ready Leadership. Jack served as the CEO for more than 25 years in the marketing and advertising field, specializing in brand development. Several of Jack's campaigns he directed have won local, regional, and national awards. His firm, Battle Ready Leadership, delivers on-site and presentations combining proven business strategies with military tactics for a unique experience. Jack, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here too. This is kind of a different show for me. Normally I bring women on to tell about some of their experiences, but this is completely different. So first of all, before we get into it, how did you get started with Battle Ready Leadership?
Well, it kind of came out of, first it started as kind of a passion of mine. I have been a student of the Gettysburg battlefield for many years. And so I used to take people up there on a more personal level, taking them up there to give them tours of the battlefield and tell stories of what took place and everything. And I always focused on the leaders during the battle. So I've been kind of a business coach for most of my career as well. So one day I just had this epiphany that, well, gee, I should probably tie these two things together. And I think the idea, really, Denise, behind all of this the motivation was that I wanted to find a way of delivering the business coaching and the business strategy and the leadership training to businesses within an environment that was a little more inspiring than typical, something a little more inspiring than going to a hotel and sitting in a conference room and that sort of thing. So that's where it all started, that I began taking businesses to Gettysburg.
It's really a cool concept. We've talked about this, and we're actually, the audience should know that we're going to Gettysburg in a few weeks. We're going to go out there. We're going to tape a couple shows, not this show, but another show.
Right.
And then it'll be airing on BPTV in the near future. But the reason why I wanted you to be on this show, Empowering Women, is people don't realize, I think, that there were a lot of empowering women during the Civil War in Gettysburg, weren't there?
Well, yeah, the Civil War period actually was just a transformational time for women. And I think if you're at all someone who is interested in the women's movement that took place in the early 20th century, it really had its roots during the American Civil War period. Women ran much of the country during the time of the Civil War because all the men were off in the war and so on. And there are some fascinating stories that go along with that. And I've tried to tie a lot of those into my Gettysburg presentation because there are some fascinating women at Gettysburg.
Because people don't really remember or realize that these weren't soldiers that went. They were just regular people working in the town. So when they left, the women had to take over, and they pretty much ran everything, didn't they?
Well, exactly. As you mentioned, I mean, this was not a professional army.
Right.
There were some certainly professional soldiers in the armies, but for the most part, these were civilians who volunteered. So they were school teachers, they were printers, they were merchants. Farmers, a lot of farmers, and a lot of farms were left, in the hands of others. So women were faced with really running businesses, running different operations, schools, and so on. And you can't underestimate, they also had to run households at that point in time. Not that they haven't always done that, but that was something that was really important during that time.
Right. And one of my favorites, Harriet Tubman. I actually read about her in one of my leadership classes for my master's degree. She was an amazing person. Well, you want to touch on Harriet Tubman for?
Well, yeah, Harriet Tubman. It's kind of interesting. She wasn't at Gettysburg, but she was one of those extraordinary women to talk about during that period. She of course, was really big in terms of the Underground Railroad. She was the first woman to ever really lead an armed insurrection in terms of leading. She actually led 150 black Union troops in one operation in South Carolina, where she freed, I believe, about 700 slaves at that point in time. I think she's responsible for freeing about 3,000 slaves during the course of time. She was just an incredible woman. The strength that she had, and she had some health issues that a lot of people don't talk about either.
Wow, okay.
She had suffered a severe head injury when she was very young, and she struggled with that a good bit of the time. But yeah, she's one of those iconic women that I think are starting to reach sort of celebrity status today. Finally, people are starting to pay more attention to people like that.
Jack, were women in combat during Gettysburg?
They were, actually. During the Civil War itself, I think a conservative number is about 400 women are said to have been soldiers or fought.
That's a good number.
During the Civil War. Well, it is. And I think the number is actually much higher than that, because many of the women actually disguised themselves as men. I mean, you figure that there were a lot of young boys fighting in the armies, 14, 15 years old. So women disguised themselves, and in many cases they weren't even known. In Gettysburg, there were some interesting stories to tell. If I can take a couple of minutes,
sure, absolutely,
because these are some of my favorite stories. But there were a couple of women who were in units at Gettysburg. One, her name was Marie Tepe, and Marie was with the 114th Pennsylvania Regiment, and her role was sort of destined, or at least preordained to be in the role of what was called a vivandier. It was a role that women would join sometimes different regiments, and they would serve as things like cooks and seamstresses and so on, somewhat of a nurse and so on. But Marie Tepe she did those things. But Marie also was, she was involved in the fighting a lot. She carried a keg of whiskey around her neck to sort of administer to the wounded troops and so on, but she also carried a pistol to protect that keg of whiskey. And what she also, though, did was she was known for getting involved in some fights. Marie was actually in 13 different engagements during the Civil War.
My.
She was wounded in the ankle, and the bullet stayed with her the rest of her life. But she wore an interesting uniform that was part of this regiment that kind of fancied themselves as part of like this French regiment. They wore these red pantaloons and so on. So she wore that uniform, but she put a skirt over top of it. And they said that her skirt was literally riddled with bullets during the course of time. And she was actually administering some whiskey to a soldier at one point in time, and a wounded soldier, and a bullet struck him while she was administering whiskey to him, and he died there in her arms. But Marie was really an interesting character. She actually moved to Pittsburgh.
Okay.
In the end. And she's actually buried here in Pittsburgh, in Carrick.
Oh, my, wow.
And I paid her gravesite a visit last summer, because I thought that maybe she had been all but forgotten. I had found out that she was buried in this.
That's not a name I recognize.
Well, she's well, it's interesting because now there are a number of people. I've realized now that there are some people who do reenactments of Marie Tepe.
Oh, okay. So she's not forgotten.
No, she's not, and that's awesome, because she was actually buried in an unmarked grave for about 80 years. No. And the Sons of Union Veterans found out about her, and they actually put a gravestone on her grave. And when I went to visit her, I expected to see a lonely, tombstone there, and I thought I would pay my respects. And there were several flowers planted around her grave, and there were a couple of flags planted in the ground around her. So there were people who actually went to visit her gravesite, several, I guess. And I wrote a blog about her, and I had gotten an email from someone saying, "Yeah, that was me. That was me. I portray her in different reenactments and that sort of thing."
That's interesting.
Well, yeah, she was
especially the Pittsburgh connection.
Exactly, and that's something. So if you want to go see her gravesite, you can go and visit Marie Tepe. And there's much more to her story, but she actually her regiment was engaged at Gettysburg, and they fought in the famous peach orchard there, which was really one of the most hotly contested parts of the battlefield.
Right, right.
If you talk about iconic locations on the
That was one
Gettysburg
of them.
battlefield, that was certainly one of them. And so there were a number of stories about her there and what she did. And ironically, transition to another woman, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
There's another woman. Her name was Annie Etheridge, and she was part of a Michigan regiment. And they actually fought in the Peach Orchard as well, but it was a different part of it. The Peach Orchard kind of came to an angle, and Marie was on one side, and Annie and her regiment was on another. And
Jack, when you say fight, they were right there fighting with the men?
they were there both sort of. What was really interesting about them was they kind of intermittently would fight
Okay.
and also take care of the troops as well. I kind of would call them sort of modern. In the modern day, you think of medics on the battlefield.
Right.
And they weren't necessarily described as that, but they were very versatile in terms of what
Wow.
they did. And Annie Etheridge was really interesting. She's someone that I wouldn't want to come up against on the battlefield. She was really interesting. There are stories of her actually riding out into the battlefield with wounded soldiers strewn about. And she would ride out on a horse while there was still action going on. And she would grab wounded soldiers and put them on her horse and ride them to the rear lines
Wow.
and so on. And she was known to actually be cheering on the troops. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, for instance, Annie came upon a bunch of Union troops that were kind of, hovering down inside of a trench. And she stopped her horse and said, "Come on, men, do your jobs, do your duty. Let's go get those guys." And they got up and charged the position and so on. So there was a General Kearney, who actually wanted to make her a sergeant in the regiment.
Wow.
And unfortunately, General Kearney was killed just a short time after he had proclaimed that he was going to be doing that. But so Annie and her regiment, again, were in the Peach Orchard at Gettysburg. And there are stories of her actually pulling back from the position with the rest of the Union line collapsed in the Peach Orchard. And it was pure, pandemonium. And they were retreating, and the Confederates were coming and gathering up troops and capturing them and so on. And a lot of stories of her actually doing just that. She came back and she was rescuing a lot of the wounded Union soldiers.
Wow.
So, I mean, you can imagine the courage of
Absolutely.
of someone like that. I mean, she didn't really need to be doing that. Nobody expected her to be doing that. And that's what made her story, as well as Marie Tepe and others in those roles, so interesting.
Jack, do you think now, since it's 2019, people are really talking about the women that were in Gettysburg more? 'Cause I don't remember any of this from history classes.
Yeah, I think so. I think quite a bit. In fact,
Why do you think that is?
well,
Just because it's a different time?
it could be it's a different time, and I think, to be honest, I think a lot of the women really didn't get a fair shake during the,
Sure.
Historians that wrote about the Civil War period didn't talk much about women's involvement.
Right.
There were a few sentences here and there. In
Sprinkle
fact,
through.
Well, yeah, and even not that long ago, the movie Gettysburg, which is an iconic movie that there's really gotten a lot of people interested in going to
Yes.
Gettysburg. Well, it's a 3.5 hour long movie, and there's one sentence delivered by a woman in that movie. And it's something like, "I understand the war is in Virginia," or something like that. So throughout history, a lot of the major narratives don't include women. And one of the things that really got me interested, I talk about the different types of leadership when I take people there, and one of the sort of the undercurrent themes is courage. And we talk about courageous leadership. And as I studied more and more about courage in Gettysburg, there were women's names that began to kind of surface in some of the stories that were being told, and told by the soldiers, and told by some of the officers. And so there are actually some credible stories of some amazing women who were civilians at Gettysburg. And if you'd like to hear some of
Sure.
that,
Can you
it's
give us one, maybe a civilian?
Yes, there's one woman who I really admire very much. Her name was Elizabeth Thorne. And if you know anything about the battle, you know that Cemetery Hill is an area that was sort of the area that the Union troops had decided this is the area that we are going to defend. If you hear talk about we're going to defend the high ground at Gettysburg, that's what they were talking about, this area called Cemetery Hill. Well, Elizabeth Thorne, the reason it's called Cemetery Hill is because the Evergreen Cemetery is there. It's the town cemetery, and Elizabeth Thorne and her husband were the caretakers of that cemetery.
Okay.
So if you see the iconic arches that enter the cemetery, that was her house.
Oh, wow. So she was right there.
She was right there in the middle of things, and her husband was away at war. He was in a regiment that was now stationed in Virginia. So
Right.
she was by herself when the largest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere was about to take place, and it was all converging on her homestead. And so Elizabeth Thorne she was present at the battle, and as the Union troops were retreating back from the areas west and north of town, where the Confederates were driving them back on the first day, they're all retreating to Cemetery Hill. So the commanding general at that time was a general named Oliver Otis Howard. Well, Howard, when he came to Cemetery Hill, began looking for people who could provide some reconnaissance because he didn't know the area.
Sure.
And Gettysburg has a number of different roads coming in and out of it. It's like the spokes of a wheel type of a situation. So he was looking for someone to do reconnaissance, and he was asking around, and finally, no one was willing to do this because there were literally shells now exploding in the area. The Confederates were really on the march here, and so Elizabeth Thorne stepped up and said, "I'll do it." And first he said, "Well, you can't do that. You're a woman, right?" So mid-19th century,
Right,
and
sure.
so you can't do that. And she insisted, and so finally he said, "Okay, we'll do this." So he decided to take her out, and she was showing him the different roadways and different ways that the troops, if they had to retreat or and so on, or if they needed to bring in supplies. And literally there were shells going off around them, and they tried to keep between her and the Confederate artillery. But as they were going along, a lot of the Union troops, they noticed this going on, and they started to kind of give General Howard a hard time, and they were saying, "General, why do you have this woman doing this? You're putting her at great risk, And he said, "Well, I'd asked a number of men, but they were too afraid to do it, or too cowardly to do it," I think was his way of saying it. And at that time, all the Union troops then started cheering and throwing their hats and waving their hats at Elizabeth Thorne. And so she did this, and she gave up her house. I'll make a long story short here, but there's a couple of fascinating parts to her story in the end here. Her home was devastated. All of her belongings were gone, and when she came back, there were a number of soldiers buried in her yard, and all of her belongings were gone. They used her home as a hospital, pretty much, so there was blood everywhere and that sort of thing.
And that was common then, wasn't it?
It was common.
Right.
You figure in Gettysburg there were 25,000 casualties casualties. I mean wounded. There were more than 50,000 casualties overall, but they left behind 25,000 wounded soldiers. So all of the homes in Gettysburg became impromptu. They were hospitals.
Sure.
So the thing about Elizabeth Thorne that was so amazing was afterwards, she, as the caretaker, this area where she was, she had witnessed hand-to-hand fighting and everything else on Cemetery Hill, and there were a number of dead soldiers. So they asked her to bury all the soldiers. So Elizabeth began burying these Union soldiers in the heat. You have to understand, during that time, this was July in Gettysburg. If you've ever been to Gettysburg,
I was there
it's
in July.
humid
It's
now.
incredibly hot.
So it was very hot, and they had assigned some men to help her, and they all quit because it was too hard
too
work, right? So Elizabeth continued on, and she buried 105 Union soldiers pretty much by herself after the battle itself. And the amazing thing about Elizabeth Thorne was she was 6 months pregnant at the time
Oh, my
when she
goodness.
was doing this. So I think if you talk to the family members of some of these troops who she buried, and they ask, who was the hero of Gettysburg, I think a lot of them would say Elizabeth Thorne was the hero of Gettysburg because of what she had done. But there are all kinds of incredible stories of courage, of what some of these women did, and civilians
Right.
as well.
Jack, thank you so much for coming on and talking about some of these women. I mean, it's just incredible, some of the stories. I mean, talk about empowering women.
it's really something. I think if you have any interest in the women's movement, we talked a little bit about Harriet Tubman.
Yes.
But my goodness, you can talk about Clara Barton, you can talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe, Dorothea Dix. I mean, these are incredible women, that I think are well worth studying and learning more about, because I think the suffragette movement and 19th Amendment and everything, you can get its history from the Civil War period.
And I'm looking forward to going to Gettysburg.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too.
And we're taking the cameras there and talking about some of the leadership lessons, and we'll be touring the battlefield, and that's coming up soon.
It'll be a lot of fun.
It'll be a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being here, Jack. This was so incredible hearing these stories, and again, they had to be the first empowering women. When you talk about something like that, how can you top that?
Well, exactly. I think it was a transformational time in our country, and they played a major role in it. We wouldn't be here today probably without some of what they did during that time.
That's amazing. Thank you again.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode. I'd like to thank my guest, Jack Carroll. He shared such amazing stories of empowering women. I look forward to attending Gettysburg with Jack and hearing more stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.